Stand Up.
Hello and welcome to the Friday episode of Stand Up. Friday comes after Thursday, of course. And Thursday night we hang out. That's why today's show's up a little late. I was hanging out with subscribers, listeners virtually for like 3 hours last night. We had a great time, as we always do. I hope that you will join us next week if you are a subscriber. If you're not, sign up now. StandUpWithPete.com. Can't do it without you, and thank you to extra sponsors of the show this week. Truebill, Truebill.com/standup. Save money on subscriptions to a whole bunch of services that you didn't even know you signed up for, forgot about. Truebill.com/standup. And I've got three great guests, because joining me today, it's, as most Fridays, Christian Finnegan and Ophira Eisenberg. And then coming up, former teacher, administrator, now education policy scholar at SMU, Dr. Lesley Black joins me again to talk about book banning and Supreme Court precedent and more. We had a really interesting and informational conversation coming up. But first, I've got to get to Ophira and Christian. Don't do the news on Fridays. I take it off because of the Thursday night hangout. Just no time to get it done, though open to ideas as to how we can crowdsource the news on Fridays and everything else. So send them over, standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, no preamble, no news, just the interviews on the Friday show. It's Stand Up Light. Let's get to it right now with Finnegan, Christian Finnegan, Ophira Eisenberg, two of my favorite comedians, joining me for a conversation about anything and everything every Friday. Check out both of them on Twitter, on Instagram. Get their albums, support their work, get Ophira's books, and so much more. All right, it's time for the song written by Gareth Sever. Should mention, oh no, I don't want to give away where Ophira is, but she's in a faraway place. But I think her feed sounded pretty good. Lost her a couple blips, minor, but I think you're going to like it. Great conversation. Let's do it.
Christian, Ophira, Finnegan, Christian, Finnenberg. However you slice them up, you get a different word. If you say it fast enough, you clearly sound absurd. When you say it louder, it sounds like they're real words. Christian, Ophira, Finnegan, Christian, Finnenberg. I don't think you're ready for what you haven't heard from Christian, Ophira, and Pete.
There you go. And there they are. Christian Finnegan, Ophira Eisenberg, after a week off because I couldn't make it work. And they joined me now, and I'm very happy to have you both here at the end of the week. And we should mention, Christian, that Ophira is in another country. I don't know which one it is, though.
Yes, I don't exactly know what country governs the place that you are right now, or is it its own nation state?
It is,
Wait, should you make it a show? Should we make people guess? It is what?
You want to know? Okay, I'll tell you who the government is Dutch.
Dutch. Okay. Yeah, that's honestly probably would have been my first or second guess.
Yeah. I would have said British.
Yeah.
I would have said British.
Yeah, good guess. And it's off of Venezuela, really, on a map.
Okay. So that's an island?
I don't know if I could swim there. Yeah, it's an island.
And they speak, what language do they speak there?
The native language, I believe, is, if I'm saying it slightly wrong, is Palmento.
Mm-hmm.
But there is English based, and they take American currency, although there is a local currency. But I have rarely seen it. But that's also just telling you where I'm hanging out. and then there's a lot of Dutch people here.
So, folks, if you guessed Curacao, you were wrong.
Curacao?
You'd be wrong.
That's a good guess.
Because Ophira is in Aruba. Everybody.
Correct. Aruba, which to me always just sounded like the kind of place that you would use in a joke to be like a ridiculous punchline. Just like, oh yeah, you know, there I was in Turks and Caicos. I'm sorry, Aruba. Just to be obnoxious.
Yeah, Timbuktu is the one I would go with. I feel like that's a place, right?
But it turns out,
like I say, Dayton. Dayton is my go-to sort of.
That's so funny.
Crap city.
Yeah, Dayton is a good one. But it turns out JetBlue flies here, so it's a free for all.
So thank you for joining. We're glad that you were able to make it work. You're actually down there though with the family, but you're working. You're doing stand up every night.
Yeah. I brought.
You're really supporting that Ophira Eisenberg tan, which you're known for. I know it's really not becoming of me to make fun of anyone's inability to tan, but yeah.
I mean, according to my dermatologist, I should never be in daylight.
Have you considered vampirism?
Yeah, exactly. She was like, you work at night inside? That's good. How about the day? Could you also spend the day inside?
He's like, you're like, I don't go outside. And he's like, well, I can't explain this. What kind of light bulbs are you using?
Exactly.
Good Lord.
Exactly. So, but I do think it's funny because the background of this, where I'm staying, is like a beautiful beach with palm trees. And you could almost pretend it was a virtual background on a Zoom. And people would just be like, no, I'm in Brooklyn. I know, it's really good, right? They make these virtual backgrounds.
Wow.
Incredible.
Yeah, your face isn't bleeding at the edges at all. It really looks like you're in Aruba. Yeah, the water's all green and blue and all. You showed me a little bit. I don't think you wanted to do that you wanted to be kinder to Christian, because we're stuck here in Winterland. And it's rainy and dreary in the Northeast, and there you are down there off the coast of Venezuela, probably about to launch.
It took us 2.5 days to get here because they kept canceling our flights because of all the storms and everything. So I wasn't even convinced it was going to happen. Huh. And then you get here and you're just like, well, and then you're like, oh, these bitter New Yorkers. I shouldn't talk to them for a while. They're very upset.
You have to kind of roll with the punches when you are running from the law. I mean, that's when you're trying to escape justice like you are. It's very important to remain flexible.
You know how we always, there's like even a column called Overheard in New York, and it's just like conversations. And, there are usually people complaining about like the price of bagels or, parking on whatever side of the street. I overheard a bunch of people talking I was like, oh my God, I'm having and they were talking about the best way to nap in a hammock.
I mean, I'm actually interested. I mean, what kind of the best way to nap? Isn't it just
lay in the hammock?
Yeah, I don't.
No, I guess they were talking about like the upside of a netted hammock.
Yeah, the inverted body positioning.
Yeah, and also you don't sweat. Because I guess one of the large problems with hammock napping is sweating.
It depends on the type of hammock you're going with, but I also feel like hammock is certainly representative of where you're at in life. Like if you can lie in a hammock, it could be any number of things. Maybe you're, working on a fishing ship and that's what they have strung across the rusty hull. But most likely you're in some kind of relaxed phase or mode. And I guess I think my aspiration is to be someone who hammocks often, but it does seem like a vacation thing.
I would say if you're sleeping in a hammock, things are either going really well or really poorly.
There's no ground. There's no ground. I also just go to the fact that, have I gone away?
You blurted out just for a second, but I'm still impressed. You're back and you're in Aruba. Here we are. Go ahead.
I just think that also means that you have a place in your land that has 2 trees. I think that's an aspiration.
Within a good 8 to 12 feet span from each other.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
So you're doing stand up down there, and I guess the weird thing is you were saying, I think before I hit record, the kind of the who's there, and it's always weird when you travel so far on an airplane to another country and you end up being with the same people. So you're saying a lot of the people there, they're A, American, and B, they're even like Northeasterners?
100%, because it's like the direct JetBlue flight. Like, honestly, that's what it's about. There's like, it's a 4-hour direct JetBlue flight from Boston or Philly or New York. So that's where the tourists come from primarily. And so, some people like live here half the year, all the time. Like there's that thing happening. And then there's other people vacationing. But I think especially after this last year, these people are like, like everyone feels it is still representative of the mood everyone has been in. Like they're happy they're here, but they're a little bit like, we just really needed a break.
Right. Right. It's kind of like, I need this more than a
that's
emotional
right.
state. Yeah.
You can really sense that.
Oh yeah. And they tell you right after the show. I mean, people have said after the show, you just sort of hang out and say hi. And people have actually said, was a friend of a friend who just happens to be here said to me, like, thank you and all of your comedian friends for what you do, because this has been a real, like, it's that kind of thing
So
where you're just
silly
like,
when you hear that.
yeah, I know, exactly. You're just sort of like, well, I didn't even make any part of Schitt's Creek, but you're welcome, I guess.
That's like, I just talked about my butthole for 20 minutes, but thanks.
Yeah. And I think I made the mistake of, going like, oh, there's all these people from New York, to start my set with a couple New York jokes, like jokes about New York that I tell in New York. Nobody's having it here. They're like, no, move on.
We're gone for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. Don't even want to think about it.
Yeah, that's hilarious. It's fascinating. And just
how many shows are you doing? I'm sorry. Did you?
6.
Very nice. And one per night, or then on the weekend, 2 Friday, 2 Saturday?
No, they're only doing one right now because, again, COVID. So everything's a little quieter.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of COVID, where are we, Christian? How would you describe this stage and phase of COVID? There seems to be a lot of talk of moving on, and we're starting to get in the clear. We don't see a dangerous variant, and maybe we can take our masks off in certain places. And also, why won't the NFL hire a black quarterback?
They're all related,
coach.
I think.
That's a variant.
Yeah.
It's hard because a lot of the people that I agree with the most on political matters and social matters, I kind of have split off from them a little bit on some of this COVID stuff, because I do think that there is a tinge of caution that almost bleeds into anti-vax, sort of, this idea that, everyone should still be staying home all the time, and obviously what's going on in New York City is different than what's going on in Omaha or Dayton. But, the numbers are really good. I think new cases were down 94% last week in the state of New York. Like, that's, and I don't think that staying home when the numbers are bad, my staying home in Queens is not going to stop someone in Texas from getting sick. And I don't think that us being out and about really contributes to a variant developing. Chances are, if/when a variant develops, it won't be here, most likely. It'll be in places that don't have high rates of vaccination and things like that. So part of me feels like I wonder if people had known back in, pre-Delta, or even between Delta and Omicron, like, get in your socializing and your enjoyment while you can, because this is going to get bad again. Like, in nothing you do now in September, October, November of 2021 is going to make a lick of difference in terms of Omicron. It's happening from another part of the world. So, like, part of me feels like people might be going a little less insane right now if they had taken advantage of the relative freedom that we had when we had it. So,
yeah,
but obviously I'm biased. I want people out. I want everyone to be safe. But, I'm triple vaxxed. You're triple vaxxed. We're triple vaxxed for a reason. Yeah.
I think the thing that I feel has been dampened is now I think we're in a state of like, well, who knows what could happen next? Like, it's sort of like, fool me once, fool me twice. And so now there is like a bit of a hesitancy in general. We had this idea like, we're back. And obviously that when you start yelling stuff like that immediately, that's going to get squashed. You're asking for it almost. But then now that, like, I feel like some people are afraid to book things. They, everything feels so tentative.
Well, it's like,
and that's not helpful.
Yeah. I mean, the three of us had put in energy into trying to book some dates and stuff. And then, one of them got canceled, and it didn't really feel appropriate or even make any sense to really start trying to book more,
right?
Because of Omicron. And I still don't know, like, well, when is the time
to
sort of really go after it again?
Well, there's a difference. There's a difference between planning the work stuff and planning travel or vacation stuff, or as Ophira does, all of it together, apparently. But, because, you take your loved ones on the good gigs. But I think that's also an important point, because you have to go to work. You got to book gigs. You got to plan, you're attending this conference, you're whatever it might be for your industry. You need to plan that stuff. And so you can't do that, and you can't do the vacation stuff, or you can. I think it's definitely changing. Now, it's been the static that's certainly been consistent, but now I feel like, I don't know, I'm ready. Let's go. I think we can go out. We're triple vax, as you said.
Yeah.
But and we got all the treatments, the new treatments. We got like tests. Like, I feel like people are more resilient. My dad, by the way, went out. I don't know if he's lying, but he told me last night he got his fourth. He got his fourth booster, and then he said, but they would only give him a dose. So he said, he's texting me, he said, I'm looking around to get another half. And then he said, I seriously hope Home Depot and Lowe's starts to vaccinate, because I love just walking around those stores. That was the whole thing. But he's got his
just needs an excuse.
Yeah. He's needs
an excuse to buy more gravel.
Yes, he wants to carry it out. He's got 3.5. The point being, there's a lot of different protections. So
I like the idea of him carrying a bag of gravel over his head, and he's like, no, just vaccinate right here. While I'm carrying it out, just vaccinate right here on the side of my arm.
All right. Well, I do want to ask you, both weigh in on the controversies of the week. Could we real quickly, what do we think about Jeff Zucker being fired or Whoopi Goldberg being suspended? Anybody want to say anything about either of those big deal issues? They got a lot of attention this week, and they were, certainly the Zucker thing was pretty shocking. And I think important because, wow, that Cuomo brother, somebody wrote the Cuomo brother blast radius is really big. But maybe since you're the only Jewish person here, do you want to weigh in on Whoopi? And she's a comedian.
I was just like, I actually thought it was innocuous and ridiculous. And I was like, someone's going to give her a slap in the hand for that, because it just seems like provoking, but not particularly, like, I don't know. If you really think about what she's saying, it's just sort of like, okay, whatever. It's not really a statement.
It's wrong.
Really a point in there.
Like incorrect, but it's not like to me directly. It's not like an attack. It's offensive. It's not offensive as so much to me. It's just factually incorrect.
Right. Like I almost like, well, this is just the misuse of words, but there's nothing going on here.
Yeah, I mean, there was somebody who is.
I was also just like, why? Just why?
I was.
Why? Just why? Yeah, good, very good.
Why?
That to me is the real.
Why is she making? Why is she making that point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't Holocaust splain. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you feel like you have a unique take on the Holocaust, keep it to yourself.
Well, fair enough, but I would argue somebody has to. Because the polling on the Holocaust is pretty crazy what people don't know. And isn't that the danger? And the only other thing I would say about that, I haven't weighed on it at all this week. I haven't really thought that much about it. But is when she was making those comments, nobody else really had a good counterpoint at the table. And that begs the question maybe how plugged in or how, sharp those particular people there are. All I would have said is Hitler had a whole thing about the master race.
Yeah. It wasn't the master religion or the master.
Right. I think we should just take it. One place I just saw wrote this. Goldberg said, and I was like, anything that starts with Goldberg said about Jews, it's just. The whole thing is hilarious.
Well, somebody said, I guess somebody defended her by saying, well, her chosen stage name was Goldberg. She's not an anti-Semite, which is why I'm changing my name to something more ethnic sounding, so I can get away with. Yeah. So I can get away with.
Domenico.
No, I was gonna go with something Chinese. Actually, really put it out there.
I don't want to go any further down this road.
Yeah, because if I change my name to a Chinese last name, I can then be way more critical of Asian people in general. That's the argument that someone's making.
I really want to hear you attempt to Chineseify your name in a way that does not go horribly.
Oh, no, I'm not.
I want to hear the one that will be like, oh, that wasn't a problematic moment.
No, I'm just going Dominic hyphen Huang, Huang.
Okay.
And
gotcha. I see you toggled through the 3 or 4 most obvious choices and went for something slightly nuanced, but still identifiably Chinese.
I was going basically exactly what happened, but I watched it.
I watched it on your face. I
did get hung up on a very common Vietnamese name, but I always pronounce that wrong. I think it's Nguyen. It's the NY, J-G. I was going to go with that, but then I thought that was too anyway, moving on. Yeah.
I appreciate, though, that you were like trying to do a couple drafts in your head quickly. I do appreciate that.
I thank you.
Yeah, you were like, no.
If I say Chen, is that racist? Like, I heard that's the little thought process.
If we're being completely honest, my first go-to was a black sounding last name, but I thought of Washington and Jackson, but those aren't necessarily black. There isn't black sounding last names, American. Those were all white names anyway. So I decided to go Asian, and I've gone hard into it. Let's talk about.
I think you should be Pete Goldberg. I think you should just lean into that. Pete Goldberg. There you go. Could be anything. Could be anything.
Anything? Do we want to say anything about the Jeff Zucker firing, or do we want to move on?
I will just say that of course, what I love is that Brian Stetler, who works for CNN, he's the media guy at CNN, is like, reports inside CNN are saying like this is some research he's done. It's like, oh, you mean what your coworkers are saying directly to you? Like my sources inside CNN are telling me that people don't think the punishment fit the crime. Well, what that tells me is that we don't know the full scale of the crime. You know what I mean? Like, they're not firing Jeff Zucker for nothing.
My source, who I just met at the salad bar at the CNN cafeteria.
Yeah.
So I think it's a cover-up for something extremely heinous.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's too weird.
Well, even if it's not a cover-up for something, even if it's not heinous, I don't think people are fully thinking through what actually happened, what that means. Is that, and I haven't done a ton of reading about it, but that this woman who he was having the affair with, that she had been promoted over other people, and that she was, obviously a former aide or a former spokesperson or something to Andrew Cuomo. And she worked for Andrew Cuomo. Oh, that's where she was from. Oh, and so with the whole Chris Cuomo thing, like, it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And the fact that it went on for so long without them saying so, that it went on for, I guess, years or something.
20. I mean, it was like a 20-year relationship. So there's like, that's the part that I feel like we're missing something. Cause it's like, so there was a 20, or they were in a relationship for 20 years. It seems like the last recent years, I don't know what that X value is.
To me, the thing that seems to be the most important for folks that would be interested in such a case isn't necessarily the kind of voyeurism or the gossip a part of it, and what does it all mean, or even the corruption of media or what's gone on at CNN or anything. I kind of think it's just interesting that you have an HR situation, and this anybody can relate to. You start dating someone at work, you have to tell the bosses, hey, we're a thing now, because it's a natural thing to date somebody that you work to. And so at what point, why is it appropriate? And you mentioned one reason might be because someone, you could be promoting them, you could have, or more importantly, you could punish them somehow. Why does it matter if we're working together, we start dating, why do we have to tell everybody?
Yeah, I know. A woman gets a promotion and all of a sudden we have to look into it.
There's
that's not quite the take.
How did she possibly get promoted? Come on.
Over that guy? Over that guy?
Were there no men that worked there?
There's got to be some going. Who look into it? Look into it.
You have to tell someone if one person is working under the other. If they're peers, I think it can be a little more.
Every corporation is different on that one. I think a lot of them have a zero tolerance policy.
What if you're the manager at Dick's Sporting Goods stores, and and the other person is an associate? They've just started working there, and they're working the cash register or stocking the shelves. What about those two?
Yeah, you have to make that known.
Even at Dick's.
Yes, even at Dick's. I think, not as much as CNN.
Especially at Dick's.
Huh?
Why? What happens at Dick's?
Exactly.
What happens at Dick's stays at Dick's. No, I think it is even important at Dick's because, again, what if that couple then breaks up and then that person who is the not inferior, but who works under the person has to then wonder what's going on. And now it's too late to go to management. And, it saves a lot of headaches. So that's why I think there's a zero tolerance policy. But I also think it's especially important in a place like CNN and the media where you really are selling credibility, where credibility is the product you're selling. That at Dick's, it's like, well, if we're having a relationship, it doesn't really affect my ability to sell some rando, a fishing rod, a soccer goal or something, shin guards. But I mean, if that
place is just basically one sexual innuendo after another. Dick's.
Yeah, shin guards, knee
pads,
shin guards,
knee pads, mouth guards.
Yeah, specifically avoided knee pads because of the sexual connotation.
I like that you went for shin pads. I was like, that's interesting.
By the way, that is an inherent difference between Christian and my comedy levels. He sees it and avoids it, and I go right at it. Knee pads, go. He's like, shin guards.
Shiny object, baby.
So, no, those are all good. I think those are all good points in terms of, but what if I just have sex with someone twice? Do I have to go to HR and be like, hey, at the Christmas party, I
think it says in the employee handbook 3 times.
Depends on company, I suppose.
No, it's zero. I mean, you're right. I think there's actually very specific language about this exact thing.
We need an HR
in
professional.
All of this stuff. Yeah. And by HR. And I think it is becoming more standardized across the board. But I think it is, for the most part, and zero tolerance because you don't want your disgruntled employee, for whatever reason, suing the company based on a relationship that they can now talk about from whatever point of view they want to.
Exactly. Yeah. I goddamn, if I was the boss and I was in a relationship, I would want to tell my superiors immediately, just so that it's established. There's a paper trail, there's a timeline, so that if things go awry, there's no gray area that this spurned X or whoever could then fill in with a bunch of details.
I just had an image of, that's a good point, but I just did have an image of CEO Christian Finnegan getting a blowjob and calling during. Hi.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know.
I'm having a romantic engagement with the coworker at this moment.
At this moment.
Well, we all know how you get those shows at QED, Christian. We all know.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. He's been sleeping with the boss.
Employee of the month again. Weird.
So the final question I had for you guys this week, because I've been talking about it with kind of policy experts, a historian and a policy expert this week, actually on this show, is about book banning. So you got to ban a book. Which book are you going to ban? Which book do you want to unban? What book are you most concerned about being banned? Where do you want to go? Holocaust, sexual stuff, racist stuff. What are we banning?
I think all the books that talk about how truth is a nebulous quantity that is up for grabs and for every individual to decide what it means.
Moral relativism.
I thought you were going. I was sure you were going to ban self-help books, but go ahead.
You know what? I'm going to say something that I'm going to think about for a while, but I'm throwing it out there. My first thought on this is, you can ban no books. That is my very first thought. I'm not saying every book can be published, but I'm saying you can ban no books.
Well, it depends what you mean by ban. Are you saying ban it from a school library, or are you saying ban it from?
That's a good point. Period? No, that's an important point.
I mean, that's super nuanced, right? I think the thing, right. That is very.
But I mean,
nuanced.
there are choices. Obviously, a school library is not infinite, so you are making choices regardless of what.
Right. If I work at a school and they're like, we're banning all the books about evolution, right. I have a huge problem with that. Mouse as a graphic novel that is talking about the Holocaust, it's just sort of like, also it's sort of interesting because it's not telling a new story.
Yeah.
It's telling the same story.
Well, and it's the same book that was written 25 whatever years ago. That's to me what shines such a light on the fucking bad faith, the absolute, bad faith argument is that, oh, things are getting too woke. The radical left is gone. So therefore, we're going to ban a book that was written 25 years ago that has been in schools without any problems. Like, oh, okay. So it has nothing to do with this new trend of wokeness. This is, arts, that Mouse is, I think it was like literally 25, 30 years ago that Mouse was written. So, to me, it's just like you're telling on yourself. And my only hope, and, it's a weird thing to hope for, but my only hope is that 10 to 20% of the people who are kind of going along with this sort of Republican, who, those quote unquote reachable people, that the idiots will go too far and they'll repel the people that they need to win an election. That's my only hope.
Right.
But,
what's happening though in my community and others is that people are just cherry picking something a teacher said or a page from a book, and now they want surveillance in the classroom. And if you start listening in on teachers, and if you start taking something out of context, then it really animates people. And so a guy in my community took photos of a few pages of a book, didn't even say what the title of the book was, just said this is what our kids are being told to read. And in those pages, it described a very graphic detail, a sexual encounter. But I'll take it further. There's important reasons as to why teenagers in high school should read books that include all kinds of dramatic and horrible tragedies, including a depiction of a rape. And I would argue it's so that what teenagers know what rape is. Like, this is when you learn about morality and right from wrong by reading about it, by discussing it. You could pick whatever you want. I just went to the most, I feel like, extreme kind of thing that often gets talked about, sexual assault and rape. Why are kids reading about this? Not to mention just consensual encounters that are detailed in a thoughtful way in a piece of literature by any number of authors. So that's my last point, and take that however you want, Ophira.
Yeah, I mean, I think right. What do you just want? You just want everyone hooked on dancing their TikTok videos and Googling whatever they want, and that's how all the information should flow through no particular lens at all. Just like all the garbage, and none of the that is right. These things should be in school because there should be a context. There should be a discussion. You should be starting to think about this stuff at an early age. So also, I mean, I think I remember like going to all I had was Judy Blume. Okay. That's all I had was Judy Blume. Sure. But I remember like Forever was that was the title that was for, I think, the adults, Judy Blume, that was for adults.
Yeah.
And all of us reading really young or whatever, we weren't adults yet, and like just being so many questions. And that's a very innocent book. That was how we started talking about stuff. And figuring things out.
And we kind of had a version of this conversation a while ago, more about the CRT thing specifically. Yeah. But to me, it's all a symptom of the same thing. It's nothing to do with protecting the kids. It's like, I don't want you to give me the oogies. How dare you force me to have a conversation with my child about sexuality or race or anything? How dare you make me actually communicate with my children as opposed to just sort of tell them the way it is, like, or to reveal to my children that maybe I don't have it all figured out. Like, how dare you make that,
or I'm scared of this. I'm totally scared of this topic because you know what? I am completely uneducated in it and I don't want to have to admit it. That no one ever, like, break the chain.
Really good points. Really, really good points. I'm glad we talked about that one.
Keep dancing on TikTok, everybody. It's all going to be fine.
Yeah.
Keep dancing.
Seriously. Yeah.
Well, these things have a way of sort of picking up that's very impressive. Ophira's doing a TikTok dance for us. These things have a way of kind of getting kind of a snowball rolling downhill where all of a sudden there starts to be a panic that sets in and people start almost trying to one up each other by, like, well, if this is offensive, well, what about this? And this is offensive and this is offensive. And eventually, I mean, history has shown, I don't know whether that'll be the case this time, is that there will be some sort of like backlash to that kicks in at some point. Like, oh my God, now you're banning Judy Blume. Are you kidding me? Do you know what I mean? We're at least 15 to 20% of the people who were on board decide to get off board. And then it becomes electorally untenable to have those positions. And, and then there's things progress in the other direction, then there's a backlash there. I mean, that's sort of the way the pendulum of culture operates.
Would you?
can't control people. And at the end of the day, they'll figure it a different way. And so then you have to consider like whatever way people want to get this information. If they're curious, what way are they? What's their channel? Is that better?
Yeah, there's a bill in Iowa right now to put cameras in every single classroom to let parents. And to me, it's like, good, do it. Make these fucking idiots sit and watch a 7th grade chemistry class. Let them do it.
But that's not. But that's not what'll happen. It'll be one person that, whose kids came home and said, guess what my teacher said? You'll go back to the tape. You'll pull that out of context and you won't see that the kid said the N-word 14 times first. I mean, like you won't.
In chemistry, which is really weird.
Which is a really weird thing to be uttering in chemistry. Right. If you had, how do you feel then? I'll put you on the spot. Would you, if you were in charge, would you ban the Tucker Carlson Fascism on the Playground book for kids? It's an illustrated how to be a fascist book for kids. Where are you on that being taught in school, Christian, or being in the library?
Man, you got me, Pete.
The Tucker Carlson School of Patriarchy for the children.
This is why I kind of I roll my eyes at a lot of these conversations, is that everyone wants to pretend that there is, you believe in white and I believe in black, or, whatever. You believe in X, I believe in Y. When the reality, there's always a continuum on these topics. Indeed. Always, on every topic. Yep. And nobody in the world believes that, that Mein Kampf should be on the reading list for 4th graders.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? And at the same time, nobody believes that, every single book, that Judy Blume should be banned, like, or whatever, that the ABCs, everyone poops, whatever, find whatever book. But we all exist somewhere on that continuum. It's about trying to, calibrate where that proper line is. Yeah. And there's been a huge amount of energy among the country's dopes and idiots to sort of drag that point of calibration in one direction. And the rest of us are kind of just agog and kind of can't believe that people are being so absurd, so that we're not really fighting to pull the clothespin back in our direction. But eventually that will happen.
I hope you're right. Great points. All of them. Well, listen, I'll let you go. If you are in Aruba this week, see Ophira live.
You know how that works.
How weird would that be? That if you just, not only are you're a Pete listener, you just happen to be in Aruba.
It happens. Someone I know happens to be in Aruba right now. So it did happen. I'm telling you.
If you're in Aruba right now.
It was $79 one night.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Well, can I just say, if you're in Aruba right now and you're listening to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, you really need to learn how to enjoy vacations more.
Agreed. Fully agreed.
You're living the best life.
Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Peter.
That was great.
Bye, Peter.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I got to run to the pick up Julia. I really appreciate it. You squeezing us in. All right, there they go. Christian Finnegan, Ophira Eisenberg on Twitter at Christ Finnegan, at Ophira E, Instagram as well. Support them. Let them know you always love when they join us. If you haven't, then maybe now's the time. Go let them know, because that's always a fun conversation. I love their introspection, their ideas, their ideology, their pushback, their jokes, their personalities, all of it. I just, so great. Had so much fun talking to them. Okay, so now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show. He is a very smart guy, longtime listener of the show, and reached out to me on Twitter a couple months ago. I'm going back and forth for years with him, but he told me a little bit more about what he does and his background. I was like, wow, this guy's a pretty smart, big deal guy. And so, yeah, I was excited to have a conversation with him for the first time a few months back. Very happy to have him back to talk about book banning and Supreme Court precedent and so much more. He is a clinical professor in education policy and law at SMU down there in Texas. He's also spent a lot of his career as a teacher and administrator as well. He teaches superintendents and people to become principals and administrators now in his new life, a new iteration as a scholar. And I'm very, very happy to have him joining me on the conversation today. He's on Twitter if you want to look him up, if you want to contact him, at Watt Black, W-A-T-T Black. Dr. Watt Lesley Black Jr. back on Stand Up right now. All right. He is back. We are very excited to have Watt Lesley Black Jr., Dr. Black. He has a PhD, everybody.
Good afternoon, Pete. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you for joining me. And what is your PhD in, by the way? What do you?
It's in educational administration, policy, and leadership, and I specialized in legal studies. So I'm kind of a little bit of a misfit in the education world because all my dissertation work was really in the legal field, and it wasn't anything that was qualitative or quantitative. So which makes me a little bit of an outlier.
But you're kind of you're kind of a constitutional law scholar when it comes especially to cases that affect education, public education, private education, all of it. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yep. Yes.
And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of history and legal precedent when it comes to what we're seeing play out. I can't even believe it. In 2022, with the banning of books, I will have, I've already talked a little bit about what's going on in the country, but you're kind of there in ground zero in Texas is where you're at, SMU, and I'm just wondering what you're seeing and what your reaction is. And before we get to kind of the history and the legal analysis and all of the really important questions, how are you personally viewing what is happening at your state house, across your state, and as well as other states with all the controversy around getting rid of all of these books? And we've seen this before. What are your thoughts on it all?
I'm concerned. It seems to be gathering steam. The movement seems to be gathering steam, and we've been down this road before, pulling book titles out of school libraries, and it just generally never ends well. And the Supreme Court has weighed in on it, and hopefully we talk about that as we get going into this. But it's not something that, what I do is I teach aspiring principals, aspiring superintendents, and so I'm trying to prepare them for the world of school administration. And what I'm seeing happening now, the threats of criminal prosecution, the lengthy lists of book titles without any real explanation, from title to title about what is particularly objectionable about it. Got a list here in Texas circulating of 850 book titles. And we've got districts just pulling books out. We have administrators and boards sort of acting unilaterally, not following their district reconsideration policies. Every school district has pretty well articulated policies for what happens when there's an objection to instructional materials or a library book, and the process that should happen before a book is ever removed. And that's to protect titles from being pulled out of the library simply because people in the school don't agree with the ideas expressed in that book. You see employees now, school employees, librarians who are frightened of they're being threatened by state level politicians who are talking about criminal charges and arbitrarily labeling books as obscenity and pornography. And so that I think that even when school districts do follow their reconsideration processes, people who are involved in that, experts who are involved in that, their opinions may be altered by the external pressures. Just, they may decide to pull a book that they think is perfectly appropriate just to avoid legal problems of their own.
Right. That's a deeply disconcerting issue right there, that trying to avoid the fight, trying to save your career, trying to not be seen or heard from. You're usually not someone, educators don't usually want to stand out and have to be activists, certainly not librarians, much less administrators and I suppose principals. But you said something I think that's really important in terms of there is a process by which these decisions are made, whether it be maybe a class or even a teacher, something that they're teaching, much less a book, that if a parent or someone has an issue with, there's a process. There are people to talk to in the school. You go through a process, and then there are decisions made, as opposed to what is currently happening, which you said is very, very arbitrary. And I will only add to it, which is, it's so easy. I'm involved in the fight in my community at our Board of Education. It's so easy to demagogue or demonize a book by pulling any one passage out of it. But when experts and people that we trust can discuss and have a thoughtful discussion about the book, that it's more than that passage and why it's being taught or why it's in the library, then you can have an obviously more educated, nuanced, and mature view on what should happen. But that's not what's happening. It's just being minimized to one passage, and I'm sure that's been the case in the past. So do I have it right? Is that the deal? There's a process, but it's just happening arbitrarily, and it's so easy, and it's happening so fast because it's so easy to demonize any one book.
I think that's pretty accurate, Pete. They're pulling, they're graphic novels being targeted, and they're being pulled for graphic images, and people are counting the number of appearances of certain words in books. And when you go into a school board meeting and you read a particularly provocative passage out of a book, you can get people, you can get board members and anybody who listens to that pretty fired up.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff, when you pull it out of context, is relatively shocking. But, part of the process is considering a book in its entirety and weighing the shocking parts of it against what educational value it brings and what value it brings to the student, and looking at it in line with the criteria that a district would use to evaluate and add the book in the first place. And I would say it's particularly important with removals. There's a difference between selection and censorship here. I mean, a school district can't put every book title in the library. I mean, every book ever written, they have budgetary and space constraints in the library. And so they naturally are going to have to select some books and not select other books. And the courts have kind of recognized that there's a little bit of difference between that. And once it's gone through the selection process and been approved and it's been looked at and determined that it meets the criteria that a district sets for putting a book in the library, then removing it, there aren't as many acceptable reasons to remove something.
Sure. That's an important. Yeah, that's an important point. It's not like someone's just putting books that they all have to be considered if they're going to be in a public school, and no one probably understands that more than the people choosing them, who will be on the hook for choosing them: the librarians, the administrators, the teachers.
And in these policies, all these policies spell out criteria for selection to begin with, and what we're seeing in virtually every district that I know of in Texas, I've looked at a lot of different policies at this point, and they all have something in them about selecting materials that reflect the interests of broad range of students that are in any given school district, and sort of reflecting the pluralistic society that we live in, and so that there's more thought towards representation of different groups of people, racial groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, religious groups, etc. And that's part of the selection process. And a lot of the book titles we're seeing right now on the lists, the various lists that are making the rounds, seem to be books that may have been selected with meeting that criteria in mind to have a more inclusive selection.
Sure.
And so anyway, we've got policies and criteria for selecting the books in the first place, and we have processes in place for handling objections and whether we need to reconsider a book that's in the library. And it involves starting at the lowest level, typically, starting with the principal. Typically, most of the policies will involve some informal discussion between the principal and instructional people at the campus level to talk about why it is that material or that resources in the library to begin with. What's the value of it, or what's the perceived value? Why do we have it? And oftentimes, when those conversations often when we have those conversations at the campus level, the objection is sort of answered, and someone will remove their objection to a resource when they understand more fully what the value of it is.
Yeah, and that's that sounds like a pretty good process, a thorough process. Right. It gives people a channel to object if they want, and then it gives the book a chance to be explained. Just before we get into some of the legal precedent of it, just one more general question about this, which is, in general, why schools pick certain books. You've already touched on it, but I think I saw The Kite Runner was on one of these lists, and that's a book I'm very fond of. It's a novel about an Afghan-American boy. It was published in 2003. The author is Khaled Hosseini. And in the book, he describes being raped to some extent as a young boy. The main character is raped. And I thought it was really important. That was one of the most important scenes in the parts of the book, because it helped explain what his childhood was like and how that affected the rest of his life. And that's just one example of it. Now, I can understand why we don't have first graders read that book. But for a high school student, it would seem extremely important for them to read a book where there was sexual assault, to read books about cases of discrimination, of racism, of oppression of any kind. It seems like it would be important, especially for young people who grow up in places like I did, where they're fairly homogenous and there's not a lot of diversity. Those, to me, are the most important places, schools, where such subject matter and such books should be given, taught, and offered. So what about that book or any other book do you think is important to have on the list, on the shelf?
Well, I think that, you articulate it very nicely, Pete. It's a matter of inclusivity. It's a matter of allowing students to have access to ideas that may push them a little bit out of their comfort zone. It's sometimes I think with a lot of these books, I mean, there are a lot of books that have scenes like the one that you describe, where they recount sexual assaults, and you can easily see how somebody who might have been a victim of something like that might find the courage to speak out, might find the courage to seek help after reading material like that.
Yeah.
So I think there are lots of potential positive impacts of kids having access to this kind of information. And, I understand that these can be upsetting scenes to read, upsetting content sometimes for kids to work through. But I think, struggle is part of the learning process, right? It's hard sometimes. And sometimes we have to grapple with ideas that are difficult for us to grapple with. And I think that's just part of the human learning experience. So we can't protect our students from everything. And I think, I'm not saying there are not books that are in libraries that may not be appropriately there. But, I think you have to look individually at the books. And I think we generally have to trust our kids to be able to handle some of these ideas and handle exposure to these things. And I mentioned earlier that some of the images that I've seen and some of the passages I've read that have been pulled out of context, I can certainly see how they might, shock a parent. And I think of, I'm in my 50s now, and I don't remember being able to access some of the kinds of things that I'm seeing now in my school library. Not that I opened every book that was in my school library, but times change and kids' sensibility changes. And what I was exposed to as a high school student, when I was 15, was a lot less than your average 15-year-old gets exposed to now. And
so, from an educational point of view, from a parenting and educational point of view, I think we need to take into consideration the times that we're in and the simple fact that when a child hears something on the school bus or sees a piece of a video, sexual content maybe, or violence or something like that, that's inevitable. It's always been inevitable that you could hear things from the older kids, especially your friend's got an older brother, and that's how you learn about sex. But you don't really learn about sex. You just heard a thing. And now it's everywhere they look. Any access to screen they have. And so you would think that parents and educators would want to do all they can to get ahead of that, or to be able to explain it in a classroom setting or even a one-on-one setting. And you would think that wouldn't be a controversial thing. Hey, let's take the path that's the smartest for the developing child and say, let's have a conversation about this thing that you are just exposed to. Because that, as you said, I used to do a joke about it in my stand-up act. If I wanted to see a naked woman, I'd have to go find a National Geographic, and I would look for, a long time, or I'd take a Playboy off the top shelf and hide it inside a different magazine and look at it at the bookstore. I mean, you just were so surreptitious about it. You could never see a naked woman. Now you can see nudity and sex anywhere you want. And so let's explain it to our kids.
Right. It's unless you completely unplug your child, from the internet and from social media.
I mean, they do, right? They homeschool.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. And even then, you've got to keep them apart from their age peers, because no matter how careful you are, they're going to hear some of these things from their social group and in person. So yeah, I think you're right, Pete, that the difficult topics need to be discussed, and kids need to have access to accurate information. And that's, I think, one of the other considerations for when we put put books in the library is that they need to have accurate information. But you're right. It's you might think you can shield your kid from that completely, but it's difficult. And I understand the parental urge to do that, to want to protect your child. But I learned that with my own kids and trying to be very careful the way I spoke around them and the words that I used and the things that were on television, the movies we watched with them in the room. And it got to a point when my son was in junior high school where, if I would change the channel because of language of a show or something, he would say, "Dad, I'm in middle school. I hear worse things every day." Right.
No, it's a tough thing for parents to do. I mean, we didn't have as many.
It's hard.
We didn't have any hangups at all. And now both my daughters are murderous sex workers. But that's not. I'm not sure that's our fault. Yeah. I think they had free agency. No, I mean that's I guess the joke is what are you concerned about? What do you think is going to happen to your kid if they're exposed to this or that? Frankly, I still judge like the parents who let their kids see movies like Jaws when they were growing up. Like their kid still doesn't want to go in the ocean. Like there's some pretty stupid things that you can show kids, and then there are the things that I almost think that you should. And this idea about your child feeling discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex must be the simply whitest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Well, I think, now that you bring that up, I will mention that the infamous list here in Texas is called Krause's List, named after the state legislator who has distributed it to school districts and to the TEA. He has said that he's tried to compile these titles largely with the idea of trying to find the titles that would cause unnecessary discomfort, shame because of a person's race or gender, and that's pulled from the language of the anti-CRT law, the so-called anti-CRT law that was passed here in Texas, and there have been several in states around the country. And and you can see that when you look at the list, a lot of them appear. It almost looks like it's they search for certain terms that appeared in titles, and if Black Lives Matter is in the title, it gets on the list. I don't know that for a fact, but that's the way it looks. But what I will say is, back in 1982, when the Supreme Court decided the Island Trees case, Island Trees versus Pico, that was some of the complaints were the same. The titles were all different. The book titles were all different. But these concerns were the same. And one of the school board members who was a defendant in the case, who had been part of pulling books out of the library, talked about a book called A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, which I think was a story about a young African-American man, a young boy, teenage boy in New York, I believe, who got addicted to heroin. And there's somewhere in the book, there's a reference to George Washington having been a slave owner. And to that board member, that was anti-American, that was un-American, that was disrespectful and one-sided. And that objection back in the late 70s, early 80s, sounds like an objection that might be raised today.
Right.
I just read earlier today about the Wilma Rudolph biography being challenged in a nearby school district here in North Texas, in the North Texas area. And it's some of those same, I think, cultural anxieties that sort of tend to flash up in the educational context. So if you look at the list of books banned by the Island Tree School District that they pulled off the shelves, a lot of them dealt with race.
Yeah, it's almost like, in the case of Wilma Rudolph, I mean, I'm not sure what they're objecting to, but she's the first American to win the 3 track and field gold medals in a single Olympics. I'm just looking up. I knew she was an athlete, but she had quite a story, as did and do many minorities in this country, specifically Black folks, obviously, that we're talking about. And it's almost as if you try to find Black folks who have overcome any number of obstacles and somehow not tell their story, because I guess what they had to overcome is going to make somebody feel, unnecessary discomfort. I just really get so triggered by that idea that a child could learn something that would make them uncomfortable versus the minority child in my kid's school, the Black kid or the gay kid or the Jewish kid who is being subjected to harm, actual harm specific to them because of this category that they belong to. So the white kid is uncomfortable learning something. What about the black kid or the gay kid who's being bullied and beaten and marginalized on a regular basis? It really is a kind of development that is, I don't know what to say about how outraged I am by that idea.
Well, it's and that's I think that's one of the troubling pieces of a law like this. And there's a straight line, I think, that you can draw from these laws and what's happening with the books now, because, a lot of the books being targeted are being targeted because the idea is that they violate these new anti-CRT laws by causing this, racial guilt that we're trying to avoid in the schools. And it's so subjective, really. I read an article last week about a teacher on the West Coast who took her students in a pretty affluent, mostly white community near San Francisco on a sort of a pilgrimage. They raised money and did a civil rights trip, which is similar to something that one of our history professors at my university has done annually, and visited some of the important civil rights sites in the South, and gone to the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and gone to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and met with people in that area and had some discussion. And, I can imagine an experience like that is not easy, right? And it is probably on many levels a pretty upsetting experience. If you've been to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, you can experience the same thing, where you go into some interactive kinds of exhibits where you experience what it was like, to be at a segregated lunch counter or something like that.
When I was 20 years old, I coached lacrosse at a private school in Manhattan. And yeah, sure, there were a lot of Jewish kids there, but I'm sure that had something to do with this. But they went on a field trip to Washington, D.C., and one of the things that they did was go to the Holocaust Museum. And I thought that was an amazing and indelible experience. And I'll never forget. I didn't go with them because I chaperoned to another museum. But I remember the kids going in and I remember the kids going out, and the kind of the way that they looked when they came out of there was exactly what they should experience and see. Is the same as this school that you're talking about in Northern California. I mean, and if you don't want your kid to go on it, they don't have to, right?
Right. But it's a life. I would imagine that being an experience that they will never forget.
Of course not.
I took kids, middle schoolers one time when I was still a principal, took kids to DC, and we went to the Holocaust Museum, and it was they left an imprint on them, and it was powerful, but it wasn't easy. I mean, they didn't feel great doing it, but they came out of it with some profound learning.
That's what going through that struggle. That's what school is for. Most families aren't going to take their kids to those museums. Most families probably don't even have access or ability or resources, maybe, or whatever reason. They don't want to do it. Whatever. That's what school. That's the best part of school. The experiences that you get to have because they're affordable, because they're offered, because a bus takes you there.
Right.
It's so important. Let me ask you about the legal issues here, the legal precedent, because I think it's important that folks understand that I'm understanding. What is the proper role of courts in resolving educational disputes like the ones that we're talking about in terms of books and schools?
That is a age-old question that courts still argue about, and I'm glad you asked that. There's a school of thought that federal judges should stay out of local school district decisions, and that's sort of the traditional idea of judicial deference, and we saw that mainly, in the early part of the 20th century, that this idea that as a federal judge, you don't have the expertise and knowledge necessary to make the decisions that need to be made at the local level, to run schools, to formulate the curriculum, and to maintain discipline, et cetera, and that school is supposed to be a local function, state level and local function anyway. And so federal judges should kind of stay out of that. But I think there was a series of 3 decisions in the 1920s where there was Meyer versus Nebraska, in which the Supreme Court overruled the state of Nebraska's law that banned languages other than English to students who hadn't gotten all the way through the 8th grade. Modern foreign language, they could still take Latin, but they were really expressively targeting German, right? And they had arrested a German teacher who dared to speak German to his students, and anyway, it ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the state, even though, and this was all done in the interest of assimilation, right? This is the 1920s and post World War I, and they said, okay, we can see how that's a governmental interest to assimilate immigrants into your community, but you can't violate the Constitution in order to do that. And in that particular case, they said that the teacher had a 14th Amendment right to engage in common occupations of life, being interfered with the calling of the modern foreign language teacher, and that was a 14th Amendment violation. They also mentioned in that case that, a couple of other things, for example, the right to, they try to define the word liberty. What kind of rights are included under the word liberty? Life, liberty, and property. And obviously, putting you in jail is taking away your liberty. But in this case, they talk about some other things that are part of your liberty. And one of them is engaging in common occupations of life, which is sort of the principle that decided the case. But then they also talk about this idea that some of the rights that are encompassed under this word liberty, under this concept of liberty, are the right to marry and raise a family and the right to acquire useful information. And so those two things sort of trigger this idea of number one, a parental right, when you talk about the right to marry and raise a family, and number two, a student right, to acquire useful information. And then fast forward 4 years, there was Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which was a private school decision. The state of Oregon had banned private schools, essentially. They passed a law saying that every kid had to go to a public school, and it was the same thing. The Ku Klux Klan had been behind this law, actually, Ku Klux Klan 2.0 in the 1920s. And it was, again, about Americanization and assimilation. And the court said, no, you can't do that. The state can regulate all schools, private schools and public schools, but they can't regulate private schools completely out of existence. And in that case, they said doing so not only violates the rights of the people who would be running these private schools, nonprofit and for-profit, but also the rights of parents to control the educational upbringing of their parents. And then 2 years later, there's a case out of Hawaii, Farrington versus Tokushiki, in which Hawaii was a territory at the time, and they were trying to regulate the foreign language schools in Hawaii out of existence. With a lot of the students so for example, Japanese students would go to public school during the day and then spend several hours each day in a school where they would study their native language. And again, in the interest of assimilation, the United States government in the form of the territory tried to put a stop to that by putting a bunch of onerous regulations in place, and the court said you can't do that. And so those three cases, they were all written by Justice McReynolds, who, by the way, was by all accounts a pretty difficult guy to deal with, and was an insufferable bigot. I've heard him described as. There's some stories about him, but these three decisions, to his credit, were written very broadly and began to advance rights. And this was the first time the federal judges stepped in and overruled what was going on at the state level with schools. And so they were criticized because of that, right? and you can imagine that the federal intervention, the federal judges, the court's intervention was not well received. And even in 1969, with the famous Tinker versus Des Moines case, the black armband case, I know you're familiar with that.
No.
Oh, well, this is the case where John and Mary Beth Tinker, Christopher Eckert, the three sort of most famous kids involved in this, wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. And this is the first point at which the court actually said kids have a First Amendment right to speak out, as long as it doesn't cause disruption, right? And they had been wearing these black armbands and they were suspended from school. And this was a watershed case in 1969 because it was the first time really that students had been recognized as having, sort of full First Amendment rights in schools. And Justice Tito Black, who was a staunch free speech advocate, came unglued and wrote this blistering dissent in which he said the judges are taking over, the school board's job, right? And we're turning over control of our local schools to the loudest mouth brats and the federal courts, right? And so this argument continues to go back and forth now, whereas some federal judges will say, we're not going to ever intervene and overturn a school decision because we're not qualified to do that, and that's That's the local school's job to do that. And that's really what's at issue here. How unbridled is the state and the school district's discretion to determine what is or isn't going to be in the library? And are there constitutional limitations on what they can do?
The problem with this whole discussion is, I'm not sure how closely you paid attention to the kind of the cable news chatter about it or the social media chatter about it, but the gotcha question for reporters, whether it be to, the president, spokeswoman, or other politicians, is, and I would argue it's how this guy Glenn Youngkin got elected governor of Virginia. There's the question that gets asked is, who should be in charge of what happens, what your kids learn in school, the parents or the Board of Education? Is at least one way that it gets posed. It's always a binary, the parents or the teachers or something. And Terry McAuliffe, I think, gave the wrong answer politically, but it was certainly the right answer, in my opinion, policy wise. And by the way, everything that you just said, nuance about the history of at least 3 Supreme Court cases on this, that's why you should let the board decide it. And furthermore, when you say the parents or the board are parents almost all the time, right? I mean, it's people that live in the community that are often have kids in the school, and they're almost always volunteers. It's a bizarre binary to create, but it certainly has helped get ratings and win elections.
Sure. And the correct answer, I don't know if it's politically the correct answer again, but the correct answer is that parents do have rights to control their own educational choices around their own child's education. That doesn't necessarily translate to controlling the curriculum.
I think that's really, really important point that I have not been making and locally or anywhere else. Such a good point. Yes. If you don't want your kid to learn this, you can have them sit out sex ed or whatever the bullshit thing that you're objecting to. But you don't get to decide that my kid can't learn this or your kid. And by the way, I trust the teachers. I trust the administrators, a lot more than myself. I'm not I don't have a master's degree. It's such arrogance, these parents deciding, what version of history or what should be taught, in my opinion. I mean, maybe I'd object to some schools. I don't know.
Well, it's I'm going to go backwards here for a second. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
But if I go backwards to talking about the reconsideration policies that districts have in place around, when books are challenged, it's pretty common, that these policies will have disclaimers in there about, the parent having an absolute right to prevent their child from checking out a book. The minute they voice, opposition to it, then they control whether or not their child accesses that book. But during the review process, most, well, I won't say most, I'll say everyone that I've looked at, every policy that I've looked at stipulates that the challenge book stays in the library during the challenge. It's not removed from circulation. That's another way I see a lot of, it appears to me that there are a lot of districts sort of not doing that now, that they're pulling them, then they're reviewing them. And so that underscores the idea that, one parent's complaint doesn't mean that they can keep every other child in the district from being able to access a particular idea or a particular book. So I just kind of wanted to throw that point in.
It's all really important points about how it should work and how it generally does work. And it doesn't have to be nearly as controversial as it has become. But then again, that would be harder to divide people and win elections and create outrage. I mean, the outrage is just, it's all cherry picking, I mean, they're just cherry picking this point or that point or these words and saying, see, they're teaching CRT. I FOIA'd, I filed a Freedom of Information request. I got documents that the board was talking about, teaching CRT. They weren't talking about it. They did talk about CRT as a result of the concerns that people are having. They talked about it, but they didn't talk about implementing it. But that's not how it got interpreted on our local Facebook page. So it's all cherry picking. It's not this nuance that, of course, we're getting from a scholar like yourself on the history of this and how it currently works and what the infrastructure in place for schools and systems are and for parents. So what about let's just spend one more question here on kind of how a board would decide to justify banning a book? I mean, how does one define pervasive vulgarity? I think that to me, the books that I would be most concerned about would be, frankly, books that taught anti-science or some really screwed up version of history. Less so the creative stuff, less so, the more controversial literature about gender, about sex, about race or religion, and more about the things that are really pose a danger of kind of misinformation.
Well, that's another good question. I would talk about, this is a good point, maybe, or to bring up this Island Trees case again, which I referenced earlier. The Island Trees versus Pico case, which the Supreme Court decided in 1982. And it's a difficult case to talk about because the Supreme Court was very divided. I think there were at least there was a plurality opinion, 2 concurring opinions, and a couple more dissents, or at least one more dissent. I mean, there are a lot of different ideas expressed by the justices in here, but I would sum it up this way. I'll tell you a little bit of background about the case. This sounds like it could be happening today. This was school board members who went to a parental group conference, the Parents of New York United, Pony U, and brought back a list of books that were bad books, right? "Quote unquote bad books." And school board president went to the high school and somehow managed to finagle a key to the library from the janitor, which is an irregular thing to begin with, to have a board member going in and sort of, I don't want to use the word strong-arming, but anytime a board member walks into a campus and they ask for something, I think it puts a employee in a particularly difficult position. So he gets into the library and finds, some of these books, goes back to the board. They make a request to the superintendent that the books be pulled out of the library and brought to them for review. Superintendent essentially says, "Hey, we have policy for this, and I suggest we follow the policy. I think it's a good policy." They blow them off. Tell them again, bring us the books. And so then they get the books and they form their own committee, which was not part of their policy for the board to form a committee. And the committee ends up coming back and saying, out of the 10 books, let's put 5 back in. Here are a couple, let's put them in with parental permission. And then there were 2 or 3 of them that the board just couldn't agree on. The committee just couldn't agree on. So the board just disregards the committee's recommendations and says, we're pulling them all, right? So this ends up going to court. And what you have is ultimately one of the, you have one of those cases where it never really gets a trial on the merits. So when school district gets sued, initially what happens is they're going to ask for a summary judgment. They're going to ask for the case to be thrown out of court. And that's what happened here. And the lowest level court did it. They threw the case out and sided with the school district. The Second Circuit overturned that and said, we think there's enough here that we need to go back to trial and determine, the facts of this case. And the school district appealed that to the Supreme Court. So when it gets in front of the Supreme Court, what they're trying to decide is whether or not this even deserves to go to trial, right? So that we can find out why these books were banned and what the motivation behind it was. And they side with the Second Circuit and send it back down and against the school district. And there are 3 judges, Brennan, Marshall, and Stevens, who say the First Amendment, right to free speech, has a corollary right, which is the right to receive information. So you have 3 judges who say that.
The liberals in that court.
Yeah, right. And then you have Blackmun, a 4th justice, who says, I wouldn't call it a right to receive information, but I do think it's a violation of the First Amendment for the state to arbitrarily deny access to ideas simply because they disapprove of those ideas, right? So, and then you have White, Justice White, who says, I'm really interested on what the board's motivation is, and I want to know that before we discuss the First Amendment issue. So that makes a 5th vote to send it back down to trial. And then you had 4 judges, Berger, Howell, Rehnquist, and O'Connor, who said, there's nothing wrong with what the school district did here, right? So you have 4 who say the school district looks like the school district violated the First Amendment. You have 4 who say there's nothing wrong with what the school district did. And then you have a 5th who says they may have violated the First Amendment, but I want to know what their motivation is before I consider that question. And we have to have a trial, right? So they send it back down to the district court. At that point, usually what happens in these kinds of cases is school districts settle, right? Because they don't want to go to trial, right? And by the time they got through this court decision, I don't think I don't think there are prospects for a successful trial. I don't think they felt like they had good prospects for a successful trial because they had 4 judges already saying what you're doing looks very suspicious here. So anyway, that's a long Reader's Digest version of what happened in the case, and so it's hard to make sense of it because
it's so island. Was that the Island Trees?
Yes, Island Trees.
Board of Education, Island Trees Union Free School District, number 26 v. Pica.
That's the full citation, and so. But I would say that there are some key things that we can take from this case, and one is that there are definitely First Amendment implications of what's going on now when boards remove books from the library. If you look at district policies in the state of Texas, every single one of them says that. They acknowledge that there's a First Amendment right implicit in access to books in the library. And I think, another thing that we can take from this case is while boards do have this broad authority to make these kinds of decisions, it's not completely unbridled authority. They have to stay within the guardrails of the Constitution. And their decisions can't be motivated. This is back really to your question, Pete. Their decisions can't be motivated just because they dislike the ideas or viewpoints that are expressed in the book. The court in this case borrows language from West Virginia versus Barnett, which was the 1945 flag salute case, that said if there's any fixed star in the constitutional constellation, it is that no state authority, however high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. That's one of my favorite quotes ever from a Supreme Court decision. But they say, boards can't do that. Having said that, they say they can remove the books if they become if they're not educationally suitable or if they have pervasive vulgarity. So that leads us to the last part of your question. How do we know? I mean, how can we tell how do we determine whether a book is educationally suitable or whether it's pervasively vulgar? And I think that's where the following of your process, of your policies is of the most importance. Right. And in fact, in this case, the court says the fact that in this case, the board ignored the superintendent's advice, ignored their own policy, and handled it in a completely ad hoc and irregular manner, leads them to really question their motives, right? And so if we are going to trust that when books are being pulled from the library, that they're being pulled for really educational reasons, legitimate reasons related to pedagogy, or because they have been deemed, to be pervasively vulgar, if we're following our procedures and involving all the stakeholders that are supposed to be involved,
right,
and then listening to the experts instead of ignoring and doing the opposite of what the experts are telling us to do, then I think if school administrators, boards get challenged in court, they're going to have a greater chance of success in defending their decisions. I don't know how to define pervasive vulgarity, Pete. I mean, we talked about that a little bit already. It's, average young adult novel, I think, has 50,000 to 80,000 words. And so, if you go through and count all the bad words, and there are 50 F-bombs, that seems like a lot, but 50 out of 75,000 words, I don't know if that's pervasive, right? So, and in fact, in PICO, the dissenters call that out and say, why should it have to be pervasive? Couldn't it just be one really vulgar passage in a book or illustration or something that would make it unsuitable?
Yeah.
So I don't know the answer to that, but I know. I know. The other thing you'll see in the policy, Pete, is the works have to be considered in totality.
Of course. So and they are. I mean, the books. The books generally, I'm going to go ahead without knowing much at all about the history of English literature. They become popular over years, if not generations, in the public first. They kind of get vetted publicly Mark Twain all the way to, Toni Morrison, and then they make it into schools and only, I would argue, almost most of the time into age-appropriate classrooms. That's why I've never thought about this. I've never worried about it. I don't think someone surreptitiously, dropping a book off at the library, or even, more pervasive, I suppose, teaching a book in English class that is somehow horrible. I would never even think about that. I get mad that my daughter's AP English teacher is teaching Dickens and Shakespeare because I'm not a fan. But I get why they teach it.
Right. Well, and we want them to read, Pete.
Yes.
If you want to get them to read, you've got to put things in the library that appeal to
exactly
to a high school student in 2022.
Which, by the way, a good example. I'm just thinking, I didn't enjoy reading when I was in high school. I really didn't. I didn't enjoy reading until I started reading comic books, which, I kind of feel bad about that, a little embarrassed that I had to start with graphic novels before I really enjoyed, books without pictures. But that's the path I took. And I am for, young people learning about history any way possible. And the first time I ever interviewed John Lewis was because of the graphic novel about his journey as a civil rights warrior, and then you look at Art Spiegelman and his book, Mouse, how is it pronounced, about the Holocaust, and these are graphic novels, and they are educational, and whatever it takes to give a child an experience, as long as they're learning and they're reading. And now, of course, Spiegelman's book has been removed, and I'm sure they'll probably come after John Lewis's at some point.
I'm not surprised by anything I see at this point.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you think that this do you think that these cases in your state of Texas, these, the Krauss list or whatever, the 800 books, will one of these cases, will a case come before this current Supreme Court on any of this? Do you anticipate?
I was thinking about that earlier today, and I think it's inevitable that we are going to see a lot of litigation around this. If this push continues the way that it looks like it's going to now, I mean, it may be, a midterm election issue, and then it may kind of become more backburnered. But I could certainly see this coming, working its way back up to the Supreme Court, simply because of the fractured nature of the PICO decision. But I worry that there are going to be a number of school districts, a number of superintendents and principals who end up getting on the wrong side of this because they, act outside of their policy and they act unilaterally to.
What does that look like? Getting on the wrong side of it?
Well, losing, losing a federal lawsuit and for violating the free speech rights of students. I think even, free speech is an area now where there's less of a left-right political divide. And I think that even the Supreme Court is going to be pretty. So, I mean, they actually expanded the speech rights of students a bit this summer with the Mahanoy area school district case that is popularly referred to as the cursing cheerleader case, the Snapchat case this summer. But I think if one of these does work its way back up, of course, with Clarence Thomas doesn't believe that students should have speech rights in school at all. He thinks we should go back to the way things, school was when the Constitution was written. And he cited in the Mahanoy case, he wrote a dissent, and he cited the old case, I believe, from the state of Maine, where a schoolmaster beat a kid because the previous day he'd walked by his house and called him old. He'd yelled out, "There's old man so-and-so," right? And the schoolmaster didn't like it. And the next day at school, he beat him. And the courts in the state upheld that back in, that's been over 100 years ago.
Jesus Christ.
A long time ago. But he cites this case as a precedent that would support school districts having just that plenary authority to maintain discipline in schools. And he would go back and overturn the Tinker decision if he had his way. But I think he's really the only justice on the court right now that doesn't believe that students should have some level of First Amendment protection in the school, or doesn't seem to adhere to that philosophy at all. So I think, if there are going to be boards who pull books, and the factual circumstances are going to make it very clear that they pulled books, that they didn't follow their policy, and they pulled books for partisan reasons, and that's going to get challenged. And I don't see how a school district will be able to successfully defend a lawsuit like that long term. So that's just, I may be wrong about that, but that's just from my perspective. It feels like
well, your perspective and analysis on it is welcome here, and I certainly would rely on it more than any that I have, as well as all the rest of this stuff.
Hey, can I make one more point?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I say that. In addition to being possibly a losing legal position, or potentially a losing legal position, I don't think it's pedagogically appropriate or in the best interest of kids to unilaterally censor what's in their book, what's in their library, or anything without going through the proper procedure. And I just want to make the point that public schools represent the first really intimate interaction with a government entity that any of us really have if we go to a public school, right? We're dealing day in and day out with the state or a state representative of the state actors. And so if we teach kids that we don't really have to follow the principles that we say that we honor, the constitutional principles like free speech and other kinds of lofty principles, freedom of inquiry and so on, then they're going to believe those things are just platitudes, right? And that I think that colors their perception of government for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I think, there's just a special importance, I think, for public schools in particular to model constitutional values.
Give me one more that, I feel like the other ones, one of the most obvious ones are something like, prayer in school, in terms of your point about modeling constitutional values and principles for the rights of their students. What would be one more example where it would certainly play out maybe on a regular or daily basis in a public school setting?
Well, you mentioned prayer in school, and I think, they're both the religion clauses, right? That school administrators have to be careful to honor both the free exercise and the establishment clause in the First Amendment. So, in making sure that we're not ever involved in coercion or endorsement or doing anything that would violate the establishment clause and violate kids' rights in that way, and at the same time not unduly inhibiting their ability to freely exercise their religion, and by putting limits on what they can do. For example, the federal equal access law protects kids' rights to form all sorts of student groups. If you allow any kind of non-curricular group to form, then you can't. It's sort of an all-comers policy after that, and that was a law that was initially passed with the idea of sort of promoting the rights of kids to form Christian groups, religious groups at school. It's ended up really advancing the cause of LGBTQ.
Yeah, advancing the cause of all marginalized communities, LGBTQ groups, and as well as like I remember in college they had expressions of color. So it was like anybody who was brown or black could well, anybody could join, but it was a group, and even now it's similar for different ethnicities and different. Right. It's interesting. I did not realize though that was as a result to kind of protect religious groups like Christians.
Right. And that, there's next time we talk, we can talk about the history of that particular law. But it protects this idea of viewpoint neutrality, which is another, important principle in the library book debate. Viewpoint neutrality, not discriminating between points of view. And so, that's one way we can model. We can be modeling that principle for our kids by not, discriminating against them because they hold a particular point of view that may not be the majority viewpoint on a particular issue. Most of it revolves around free speech rights, respecting their privacy, making sure we're following the law in terms of discipline, giving them due process, respecting their due process rights, respecting their right to privacy in terms of searches and seizures, and making sure we're following the law there. And, that's really what my work is all about, in terms of training future administrators, is making sure that they create environments that respect the rights of all their stakeholders, their kids, their parents, their employees, and everyone. And if we don't do that, particularly with the kids, then they end up, they're pretty good at detecting BS, right? And,
sure.
And they're pretty good at detecting hypocrisy and okay, well, they're saying this, but they're doing that. And that's to me, that's a danger. And we want to make sure we're not doing that. And then there's a lot of language in the Supreme Court decisions about that, if we don't uphold these constitutional values and we teach them that they're nothing more than platitudes, they're not, again, to quote the court, they're not closed circuit recipients of only the things we want them to know.
Such a good point, and a
they're
good
people.
Yeah, exactly, and a good place. I think to wrap it up, man, what a great educational conversation, and so important. It's really scary how quickly this is happening, and we can't talk and learn enough about it. And I greatly appreciate being in your classroom today, Professor.
Thank you, Pete, for having me. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, we'll talk soon again. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
All right, well, there he goes, and very happy to have him back. Learned a lot there from Dr. Lesley Black Jr. He, of course, a clinical professor in education policy and law at SMU. He was a teacher, he was an administrator, and it's great to get his perspective on all of these really important issues. I'll be talking next week with famous author Lori Hulse Anderson about book banning as well. Such an important issue, watching it play out in your town, in your community, your Board of Education meeting. Get involved and stand up for freedom of speech for and against these book bans that we're seeing starting to take place all over the country. And thank you again to Christian Finnegan, Ophira Eisenberg, and to you. An amazing week of shows. Sorry I got this one up late. Really appreciate your support. Can't do it without you. Go to standupwithpete.com or patreon.com/standup. And if you're a subscriber whose credit card expired, now's the time to sign back up in case that happens. That happens. I have to say that probably at the beginning of every month, because people don't even realize it, and then they stop getting the email, and they're like, what happened? So make sure you look into that. All right, that's it. That's all. I hope you have a great weekend. Thank you so much for listening. I love you, and I'll talk to you Monday.
Only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.